Adobe Digital Editions. Star Trek _ Deep Space Nine. A Stitch in Time. Andrew J. Robinson. EPUB window. Focus on book content text. Really? What? She laughed with that sudden delight. That you treat people like they don't exist. I managed to remember. Really? She repeated. Well, it will do him some good. An oversized head is not attractive on a man. The night horn signaling return to quarters blew in the distance like an ancient call. The walls of the tunnel dissolved. I had re-entered a different world. Good night, Elim. I know you'll make the choice that's right for you. She ran off. It took me several moments before I could put movement back into my body. When I did, I realized that for the second time in my life I could fly. Book content text. 14 entry : Still no word about the impending invasion. I didn't want to return to the shop after lunch, so I lingered at my replement table, strategically placed opposite the airlock doors to watch the comings and goings of the station. There wasn't much activity, mainly Klingons coming from or going to the war front. I soon grew bored and decided to move to my other observation post, the second level of Quark. When I entered, I was surprised to see them serving the lugubrious and lumpen morn at the bar. A spirited Durbo game involving several Klingons and a serious-looking Durbo girl I hadn't seen before caught my attention. If Quark had been present, he'd be giving her one of his congeniality lectures. I truly sympathize with the young woman, if I had to spend all day with these drunken dolts. Can I help you, Garak? From Ask. What brings you back to Quark's? Don't tell me you miss being abused by your brother. Can't know, he replied, blushing. He's away on business and I agreed to look after things while he's gone. How kind of you, I nodded. If I could have some Kanar upstairs. Certainly, Rum replied. I smiled at Morn and moved past the Durbo game, which was heating up. The new Durbo girl, however, maintained an appealing coolness and calm. My favorite table was occupied, as were most of the tables on this level. I was evidently not the only one taking a break from work. Finally, I found one from where I could observe the first level as well as the upper promenade. Rum soon appeared with a small container of Kanar. He was wearing an outfit I had made for him. Here you are, Garak. I hope you enjoy it. Ever the gracious host. Thank you, Rum. And please, try not to let your caller lie there like a dead targ. I adjusted the offending fabric, and Rum sweetly tolerated my fussing. Rum returned downstairs, and I realized as I took a sip of my drink that I was in a dangerous mood. Drinking in the middle of the day. The doctor would be quite disappointed with me. When I'm unable to immerse myself in word, my mind becomes occupied by an invading army of thoughts intent upon conquering all equilibrium and peace. Kanar is a valuable if unreliable weapon I employ against this army. The pills the doctor gives me are a poor substitute. Ever since the Romulan business and Captain Sisko's near breakdown outside of the doctor, whom I told shortly after the incident, no one knows about this, but one recognizes the symptoms. I've been obsessed with memories of Bamaran. Somehow, in the convoluted recesses of my mind, my years there are related to my exile on this floating prison. Yet no two places could be more dissimilar. The Klingon commotion from the Durbo table momentarily distracted me. I took another sip of the bitter-sweet liquid. 3 Lubac was right. I did think I was smarter than anyone else. And at the same time, I hadn't felt that I belonged at the Institute. I'd been an outsider with no pedigree, and there were those students who'd never let me forget it. One Lubac and his inbred clan. But I had been just as taken with the quest for power at Bamaran as anyone else, and determined that I would make my mark in the competition. I laughed to myself, and a few heads turned. I nodded and smiled back. Another drunk talking to himself. A scream cut through my thoughts and the bar. I looked down and saw him flying over a table and Morn scurrying out. There was only one Klingon left in the bar, a giant who had the terrified Durbo girl by the arm. Without thinking, I threw the container of Kanar down and it crashed at the giant's feet. He looked up, and I immediately knew two things about book content text. Him, he was inebriated beyond reason, and he was one of their shock troopers, a calloused veteran of hand-to-hand combat. I took a deep breath. As dolts go, he was quite impressive. My spirits were suddenly and immeasurably lifted. You spoonhead. He growled at me. I hated that word. And you? a great warrior who brings down Durboat girls with a single blow. He looked at me trying to decide if I had insulted or complimented him. P-tac. I shouted, I mean that you're the biggest coward in the Klingon Empire. He released the Durboat girl, and as he moved to the narrow stairway I thought that he was also the biggest Klingon in the Empire. I looked for my advantage. This was not an equal match, and my gigantic friend was in the full flush of a berserker bloodlust. I sighed. I'm too old for this, I thought. I needed to slow him down and find better ground than this. As his head appeared coming up the narrow circular stairwell I charged, grabbed hold of the stanchion, swung my body around, and kicked the side of his head with both feet. This just made him angrier. I made for the upper promenade and wondered if Kalex might be enjoying this spectacle from wherever he was. The giant's roar caught the attention of the people on the upper promenade, one of whom was Chief O'Brien, who emerged from an alcove where he had been doing some repair work on a panel. Garak, what have you got yourself into now? He asked as I approached. Get security, Chief, and tell them to prepare the biggest cell they have. Or a smaller coffin for me, I said as I moved into the alcove and squeezed through the opening where the panel had been. I had an idea. I could hear the chief behind me try to reason with the berserker, who just pushed him aside. I came out into a Jeffries tube. I wasn't sure which direction to take, but I had to choose quickly. My pursuer was struggling with a small passage, but he was not going to be deterred. Go left, Garak, the chief kindly directed, and take the third opening on your right. I think he understood my plan. The massive Klingon followed me as I ran up the tube. 1, 2, 3 openings. Could I fit in? No time to debate. I squeezed in on my belly and shimmied forward. The giant grabbed hold of my left foot and started pulling me back. I strained against his vice-like grip, and my boot came off in his hand. I managed to shimmy beyond his reach and thankfully out the other end and into a larger parallel Jeffries tube. I turned back to see if the Klingon was foolish enough to follow. It was such an obvious trap. His anguished roar answered me. Somehow he had managed to squeeze himself far enough into the passage to get thoroughly stuck. He couldn't go forward or back, and I recognized the look on his face. He was suffering from a claustrophobic attack. The more he struggled, the worse it got. He moved. It'll only get worse, I warned him. His look was a mixture of wanting to kill me and desperately needing my help. He moved. He calmed down. Keep breathing, deeply, deeply. That's right. Help me, he croaked. I was touched by the giant's childlike surrender. I knew the feeling well. I will, I replied and immediately wondered why I had agreed. I'm getting soft, I thought. However, I needed to find someone who could help me help him. He leave me. His voice was on the edge of panic. The tables had indeed turned. I won't. But you must promise me that you'll behave once you're extricated. His eyes flashed with impotent anger. I decided that I might as well get something for my trouble. I'm not going to help you unless you promise me that you'll behave like a gentleman. I promise. Claustrophobic anguish won out over Klingon pride. And you must promise me one more thing. I wasn't finished. What? That you'll never call me or any member of my race a spoonhead again. Book content text. But you are a spoonhead, he reasoned. The request was incomprehensible to him. I am warning you, unless you make a solemn warrior's promise, I will desert you. I promise. The poor creature was nearly in tears. I almost felt sorry for him. The day after the incident, Odo called me in to take my statement. As I approached his office, the giant, accompanied by 2 security people, was coming out. He stopped when he saw me, and I braced myself for trouble, as did the 2 guards. Instead, he solemnly thanked me for staying with him until O'Brien and Odo arrived. I wouldn't have expected that from a Cardassian. You see, I haven't forgotten my promise, he assured me. They moved off, and I must admit that I was quite taken aback. Evidently there is honor among dolts. Odo was his usual thorough self. After my version of the incident, he reckoned that since the damage was minimal and the Klingon was returning to the front, the case could be closed. What about the Durboat girl? I inquired. She's not pressing charges. How magnanimous of her. Magnanimity has nothing to do with it. Court won't let her, Odo said with disgust. Let me guess. Bad for business. Yes. But she seems quite interested in seeing you to express her gratitude, Odo said with no irony. Well, that's not necessary. As you wish. Her name is Tirimara. The name rang a bell. I was about to leave when Odo asked about the designs for his new sartorial look. I could see that he was masking his concern, so I assured him that the sketches were some of my finest creations, and would be ready within the week. He grunted his thanks and I stepped out onto the promenade. Love to make fools of us all. Book content text. 15 entry: The days of preparation for the competition were exhilarating. They started when 9 approached me as I sat alone in our quarters reading the first part of Ceylon Perez's Eternal Stranger, a saga spanning several generations of a Cardassian family during the early and middle Union. Spellbound by its magic, I tried to avoid the interruption until I saw the expression of the immense awe on 9's face as he stood waiting. I then understood why he was there. Sharaban once says that the first meeting. Should you be telling me this here, 9? I interrupted. Perhaps he could carry a message, but he didn't know how to deliver it. At that moment 8 appeared and paused in the doorway to register 9 and me before going to his area. 9 was nonplussed. He didn't know what to do. I put my pad back in my compartment, stroked my lip who was visible only to me and quickly walked out. After a confused moment, 9 followed. When he caught up with me in the corridor he tried to continue with the message, but I motioned him to be silent. His almost total lack of awareness astounded me. He must indeed come from an important family to have lasted this long at Bamaran. The subtleties of security training were evidently eluding him. We were well into the common ground triangulated by the 3 first-level buildings when I stopped and faced him. Was this necessary? 9 asked. Judging from his offended air, any kind of security was beneath him. What's your message, 9? I smiled at him. I wanted to slap his pinched, inbred face, but I doubt that would have furthered my cause. He liked me even less, especially in the present situation. Sharaban 1. It stuck in his throat. Why was I, the low-born 10 with no connections, on the receiving end of this message? I waited and continued to smile. Yes, 9. He grimaced as if he swallowed something bitter. The first meeting is tonight, after your tutorial. You're to report to the Palestro for cleanup duty. The assignment has been filed with one Tarnal, who will meet you there. 9 was now back to his officious self. This is extremely confidential. 10. He ended with a final attempt to maintain his superiority. I assume 8 is accepted, I replied. What? He had no idea what I meant. 8 had walked into our quarters and seen the 2 of us, and was at this very moment putting together a scenario that would be very close to the truth. Of course not. No one must know. The fate of Bamaran depends on these plans, he intoned. The young man who's received wisdom consists of the scraps others have thrown away. Thank you, 9, I replied graciously. I know he wanted desperately to ask me why I was being involved in his cousin's mission. He certainly didn't dare ask Sharaban, and it was beneath his dignity to ask me. He swallowed again, an even more bitter taste, and marched off to a life of diminishing returns. It was just as well 8 was alerted. One of my goals was to get him involved before he was recruited by Ray McClellan. When I arrived at the Palestro after a computer systems tutorial at which I was severely criticized for my wandering attention, 2nd and 3rd level agonistics, the advanced training phase after the pit were just finishing. One Tarnal met me in the main atrium and led me to the custodial office, where I was given implements and instructed to work until I had cleaned the 12 studios and 2 hygiene chambers in the building. Another merc was supposed to assist you, but he's been reassigned, and nobody's taken his place. Don't dawdle or sleep, and be out of here by the morning classes. Now get going. As I walked away I heard the custodian ask Tarnal what it was I had done to deserve this punishment. Book content text. Nobody told me, but I know he's got a mouth on him, Tarnal replied. I was well into my 5th room, and convinced that Sharaban had set me up and that I was being punished, when a person I didn't know suddenly appeared in the doorway. He looked around to make sure I was alone. Follow me, he said, satisfied that I was. His body had a low and powerful center of gravity, and his eyes sliced into me when they made contact. There was no denying him. I dropped what I was doing and obeyed. Without a word, He led me down 3 subterranean levels and into a conference room that featured a large monitor at one end. Sharaban and an immensely overweight student were waiting. The latter's formlessness was a contrast to the compactness of my guide. Is this the Merc? The heavy one asked. You don't recognize him, do you? Sharaban replied with his smile. He's filthy, the heavy one observed with a contemptuous look. I've been cleaning half the night. I was indignant. The work was bad enough without the insult. I didn't ask for your opinion, Merc. The fat student snapped. The sharp-eyed one just studied me, which added to my disorientation. A Merc who got by you twice, Sharaban needled. He was enjoying himself at the fat one's expense and I was the instrument. I don't think that ever happened to you before. Sharaban turned to me. He still doesn't believe it happened. The other snorted in disgust, and his jowl shuddered in agreement. I wondered how someone that heavy could endure the physical regimen at Bamaran. He truly was the exception to the reigning student ideal of lean and muscular. We'd better get started, Sharp Eyes quietly suggested. This is 10 Lubac, Sharaban abruptly announced to the others. 10, this is 1 Drabber, indicating Sharp Eyes, and this is to Sharaban, who was eager to finally meet you. 2 snorted and shuddered again. 1 Drabber moved to a control panel and entered a code. An image appeared on the monitor that was part topographical map and part diagram. There are spies operating everywhere, and we know who most of them are. The best ones we don't know, of course. Sharaban was not smiling when he looked at me. You'll be approached by Ray McClellan if you haven't been already. He paused and the 3 of them looked at me. I now understood 1 Drabber's function. No one but 1 Sharaban has talked to me about the competition. I directly addressed Drabber. He held my look with his probing eyes and then turned back to Sharaban, who computed his look before he continued. Ray McClellan will expect it. 10, Sharaban ordered. It was impressive how he could move with warp speed between smiling charm and steely command. I nodded in response. He referred to the monitor. The rock formation at the center is the one Gradmark successfully defended 2 competitions ago. Tarnal couldn't touch them. It doesn't look like much of a challenge until you actually get out there. The exposure, the slope of the terrain, it all works for the defender. Considering the stakes of this competition, Ray McClellan is well advised to defend here. He pointed to the redoubt, an obvious stronghold for the defenders. It's a real challenge. Sharaban fell silent, and the 4 of us studied the graphic. This was a part of the wilderness I was not familiar with. Sharaban was right. At first sight it didn't look formidable. But as the coordinates revolved dimensionally and we perceived the gradual and insidious angle of the rising slope that led to the formation, we understood that the shape of the high ground allowed for no blind spots. There were 360 degrees of unobstructed exposure for the defenders. Any ideas? Observations? Sharaban asked. Ray McClellan bastards. To Sharaban muttered. Look at that. His stubby finger traced a circle in the air. They can see everything around them. They won't need that many men scanning. Book content text. Terrain from inside. So of course they'll commit the better part of their troops to the flanks coming out of either side of the rock formation to intercept any attempts to get behind them. Which can work to our advantage, Drabber said. How? Sharaban asked. If a small force can get behind their position, they'll encounter less resistance in a surprise attack, Drabber replied, never taking his eyes off the diagram. But how do we get behind their position? Sharaban asked. Outflank them. It's the only way, to Sharaban maintained. Both sides. Sharaban pressed. His fat second paused. Not sure. Yes, he finally replied. Then what's left for the main frontal attack if we commit enough troops for both sides? Sharaban didn't wait for an answer. No, Drabber's right. It has to be a small flanking force that surprises from behind and executes a holding action while the main force engages frontally. Sharaban was sure of that much. How do we get behind, Drabber? He wanted an answer. I don't know yet, Drabber replied. 10. Sharaban's eyes were almost angry, as if to ask what I was doing in the same room with them. All charm and politesse were gone. I was startled. It was the same look he'd given me at the central gate when I early announced my success. There's something I don't understand, I began carefully. Why can't a small force position itself behind the enemy before they array their flanking positions? Because, Merc, they are allowed to establish their position before we can begin our attack. To Sharaban threw an exasperated look to his superior. They can dig in. 10, Draver explained, and then we have from dusk to dusk of the following day to dislodge their position and take their place. Sharaban punctuated. Why are we dancing around? 1. His second wanted to know. You invited the Merc for a reason, and it wasn't to ask stupid questions. They all looked at me, to Sharaban with an impatient sneer, Draver, like I was another graphic on the monitor, and one with a questioning smile that wondered if I knew that this was the right moment to grab my opportunity. The image of Palatine stroking her ridges appeared. I am here because I know how to get past their flanks and behind the rock formation, I said with a confidence that was part bravado. Really? Well, mates, I'm glad to have been present for the second coming of Ghoul-Menoch, the fat Sharaban bellowed with utter contempt. Ghoul-Menoch was a legendary hero of the early Union. I bit down and held my ground. Do we know the status of the moon that night? I asked. What do you think? 10. Sharaban returned the question, not unkindly. If it was their choice of time as well as place, all three will be at full strength, I answered. He nodded in agreement. I was now on surer footing. But it's not that important, Draver interjected. In a competition, all the night probes are coming from one source, the defended area, and they're trained on the expected direction of the attack. Night is not the advantage one would expect. But still enough of an advantage for the major part of an attack to take place, to stated. And the advantage grows proportionally to the skill level of the flanking force in operating with stealth, Sharaban added, looking at me. I knew what he wanted. It didn't take genius for someone to figure out that my success in the wilderness depended on my ability to diminish my presence. But to give him what he wanted meant that I would have to teach others the skill. What would I be left with? Would I not surrender the source of my power? And what would I receive in return? The image of Palatine helped me to remember what I had learned that night, that I was being offered the opportunity of a greater power. Sharaban watched me. I was at the edge of my experience, and the only way I was going to expand the frontier was to act. The difficulty is finding students who can execute the necessary maneuver, I said, answering Sharaban's look. OCM 0, 100